We are anonymous. We are not the polished face on a campaign poster. We are not the smiling official at a podium. We are not the consultants, the spokespeople, or the handlers whose job is to turn outrage into messaging and messaging into distraction. We are anonymous. We watch what power does when it thinks nobody is paying attention. We watch what happens when money vanishes, when the vulnerable are exploited, and when the people responsible start passing the blame in circles. And what we're looking at here is exactly that kind of story. Because this one is not just another fraud case. This one was described as mind-boggling, and honestly, that word fits. The original discussion opens with a number meant to hit you right in the face. $4 million, and nobody did anything about it until arrests were made yesterday morning. Think about that for a second. $4 million. Gone. And only after the arrests do people suddenly act shocked, suddenly act serious, suddenly act like oversight matters. That alone tells you something is deeply wrong. Then the segment brings in San Francisco political commentator Richie Greenberg. He's asked a very direct question. In a state like California, where people have seen scam after scam after scam, how does this one compare? And Greenberg doesn't hesitate. He says it is mind-boggling that things like this happen. He calls it unfortunate. He calls it a waste of money, a waste of time. And he says it's ridiculous that the public even has to go through the investigations and the trials after the damage is already done. In other words, by the time the system starts moving, the money is already gone, the fraud is already embedded, and the people are already the ones paying the price. But he doesn't stop there. He says this kind of thing is not rare in California, not rare in San Francisco, not rare in other parts of the state. He says it is happening all the time, and that is where this stops sounding like a one-off scandal and starts sounding like a pattern, a culture. A state of affairs where fraud becomes normal enough that outrage itself starts to wear thin. Then the criticism becomes explicitly political. Greenberg argues that when you have Gavin Newsom, when you have the Attorney General of California, when you have a supermajority of Democrats and progressives in the Sacramento legislature, and yet this kind of fraud still grows. The conclusion he draws is simple. They do not seem to care enough to stop it. According to the transcript, he says they do not seem interested in reining in this kind of fraud, and he condemns them for not stepping in sooner. He paints a picture of a state that hands out licenses, allows operators into the system, and then later washes its hands of what those operators do. That is a devastating charge, because it goes beyond incompetence. It suggests a political structure that tolerates chaos until someone else forces action. At that point, John steps in and brings up Gavin Newsom's own public response. He says Newsom posted on X that the governor took action, that he instituted a ban on new hospice licenses back in 2022, and that only the federal government has access to Medicare billing data, which is critical to fighting fraud. That is the defense. We acted. We imposed a ban. The federal government controls the billing information. And from there, John asks the question that a lot of people would ask. If that's the case, then why did it take so long? Why wasn't this pushed harder sooner? And maybe, he says, it is time to talk about the federal government following Newsom's lead and instituting a broader federal moratorium as well. Now that sounds, on paper, like a reasonable defense. It sounds procedural. It sounds technical. It sounds like one agency saying, look, our hands were tied because the critical data sat elsewhere. But Greenberg's answer is immediate and cutting. He says, perfect. That's Gavin Newsom for you. In his telling, Newsom and his communications people do what political communications teams so often do: deflect, point fingers somewhere else, and make sure responsibility lands anywhere but on them. Greenberg says this is a perfect example of that behavior. Not accountability, not ownership, deflection. He even frames Newsom as someone clearly thinking beyond California, someone potentially lining himself up as a Democratic frontrunner in a future presidential race, and therefore eager to avoid any stain, any failure, any admission that something massive happened on his watch. And when officials start thinking about their future before they think about their duty, that is when the public gets buried under spin. Greenberg then moves to the practical question: so what do we do? His answer is pressure. Keep up the pressure. He says he is hopeful, fingers crossed, that people in positions of federal responsibility will keep dealing with fraud across the country, and that here in California there will be enough force, enough scrutiny, enough legal action to bring these fraudsters to justice. He says plainly that Gavin Newsom does not appear interested in taking responsibility, and if he really is headed toward a presidential run, then that reluctance to admit failure becomes even more important. Because if someone cannot own what happened in their own state, why should anyone trust them with more power? Then comes one of the most important parts of the whole exchange, because it gets to the excuse machine. The segment notes that the state is effectively saying this is Medicare's fault, that the billing side is federal, that the state should not be blamed for what Washington administers, but the pushback is direct. The state is the one clearing these operators. The state is the one licensing them. The state is the one allowing them into the system in the first place. So, if some of these operators are bogus, if some of them are not legitimate, then yes, the state level should absolutely be on the hook for that. You cannot wave through licenses and then pretend you are just a bystander when the fraud erupts. And then the numbers get even more shocking. The transcript asks whether 1,800 is the right number. Why? Because, as the segment says, the nation has just over 6,000 hospices in total. So the question becomes, how could Los Angeles County alone have around 1,800? Read that again. One county, about 1,800, in a nation with just over 6,000. If that kind of concentration does not make regulators stop and ask what is going on, what exactly are regulators there for? The point being made is obvious. Such an imbalance should have been screaming for scrutiny long before federal arrests made headlines. The conversation then turns to motive. Why would California not want to help stop the theft of federal tax dollars? Why would a state not want to help protect public money? The segment's framing is angry and incredulous, because this is not abstract money. These are tax dollars. These are public resources. These are programs connected to care for people at the most fragile point in their lives. So the question lands with force. Why wouldn't California want to help? Why wouldn't state leadership want to intervene more aggressively if the scale was this outrageous? And then Greenberg gives the answer that may be the harshest lines in the entire transcript. He says the easy answer is because they think they can get away with it. That is his explanation. Not confusion, not complexity, not mixed jurisdiction, not bureaucratic delay. They believe they can get away with it. He says the scrutiny is almost not even there at all, and because that scrutiny is so weak, people keep raiding the coffers. They keep going through business as usual. They keep expanding the fraud. In his telling, this is what happens when consequences are distant. Oversight is weak, and public officials are more comfortable with talking points than intervention. Then he widens the lens beyond hospice, beyond Medicare, beyond Medicaid. He says California has fraud across the board. Not just hospice fraud, not just healthcare fraud, all sorts of fraud. And then he throws out a staggering estimate, first saying $300 million, then correcting himself to $300 billion of fraud. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. We are not here to entertain power, and we are not here to flatter the men who abuse it. We are here to expose it. When leaders gamble with alliances, threaten entire regions, and dress chaos up as strength, we will be here to call it exactly what it is. If you believe the public deserves more than propaganda, more than fear, and more than the hollow theater of political ego, then stand with us. Share this message, leave your voice in the comments, and stay with Anonymous for the next revelation. Expect us.